The Last Lightkeeper. All present-day references and technological details in this episode are used fictionally. Any resemblance to real systems or events is coincidental. This is a work of imagination. Welcome to Human Drift, a place for night minds, tired bodies, and the quiet questions that rise when the world finally falls silent. A lighthouse in space. A lone keeper. A beam that sweeps the dark. And a mind beginning to fray at the edges. The station hung where no star should linger. Out past the shipping lanes. Out past the colonial moorings. Out where the deep began in earnest. And the roots grew thin, and the old maps ended in warnings written by hands long since dust. It was called Beacon 17, a lighthouse, not metaphorically. The designers had been sailors once, or their grandparents had been, and the memory of oceans lingered in every rivet, every hatch. The keeper's name was Mallory, or had been. The days folded into one another like waves. The weeks became one long sweep of light and dark. The months. Mallory no longer counted months. There was only the beam. The beam swept. Every 14 seconds the great lens turned, and the beam swept out into the void. A lance of light piercing the emptiness, marking the station's position for ships that might come, or might not, or might have stopped coming years ago without anyone thinking to send word. Mallory watched it. Every sweep, 14 seconds, the beam swept, and the darkness returned, and the beam swept again. It was hypnotic. It was necessary. It was the rhythm by which all things were measured. The brewing of tea, the checking of instruments, the slow walk from the observation deck to the living quarters and back again, timed so perfectly that the beam would sweep. Just as Mallory reached the eastern porthole, illuminating the dust that hung in the recycled air, catching it like snow, like stars, like something holy. The station groaned. Always it groaned, the hull settling, the joints flexing, the old bones of the structure adjusting to the cold and the pressure and the endless pull of nothing. Mallory had grown used to it, or thought so, but lately there were other sounds. A tapping in the walls. A whisper in the vents. A sense of something just beyond hearing, riding the edge of the beam's passage, arriving and departing with its sweep. 14 seconds, the beam swept, and Mallory listened, but the almost was the problem. The routine was sacred. It had to be. Without routine, the days would bleed together, and time would lose its meaning, and a keeper could drift, could lose the thread, could wake one morning and not remember sleeping, or sleep one night and not remember waking. Mallory knew the stories. Every keeper knew the stories. The man on Beacon 4 who had stopped logging his reports and was found sitting at his post, still breathing, eyes open, staring at the sweep of the light, mouth moving soundlessly, saying nothing. The woman on Beacon 9, who had filled her logbook with the same sentence, page after page, until the resupply crew arrived and found her laughing in the galley. Surrounded by torn pages, the words always the same. It watches me when I'm not watching it. The keeper on Beacon 12, who had simply vanished, leaving behind a station in perfect order. Every system functioning, every light burning, and no sign of departure, no suit missing, no escape pod launched, just an empty chair and a cold cup of tea and a logbook that ended mid-sentence. Mallory did not think about these things, or tried not to. But the beam swept, and the thoughts came with it, carried on the light like dust, like whispers, like the faint static that sometimes crept into the communication array when the solar winds were high. 14 seconds. Sweep. 14 seconds. Sweep. The routine was sacred. Morning, though morning was only a word here. A memory of a sun that rose and set. Morning began with the instruments. Check the lens. Check the rotation. Check the fuel cells. Check the navigation beacon. Check the life support. Check the water reclamation. Check the seals on the hull. Check the shutters on the observation ports. Always in order. It had to be. Always tea. Mallory brewed it slowly, carefully, watching the leaves unfurl in the hot water, dark and delicate, like something drowning, like something blooming. The cup was warm in both hands. The steam rose. The beam swept. And Mallory sat in the observation deck, looking out at the nothing, the great and terrible nothing, the deep that stretched in all directions, darker than any ocean, emptier than any sea, and felt, yes, calm, or something like calm, or something that pretended to be calm while underneath. Something else stirred, something that had no name, something that lived in the spaces between the beam's passages, growing stronger each time the light moved on. The station had been built for two. There were 2 bunks in the sleeping quarters, 2 chairs in the galley, 2 suits hanging in the airlock, 2 names on the original manifest. But Mallory had arrived alone. Budget cuts, the briefing officer had said. Personnel shortages, temporary assignment, 6 months, maybe 8. Then a partner would be sent. That had been. Mallory checked the log. 16 months. 16 months alone. The second bunk remained made, sheets tucked tight, pillow smooth. The second chair remained empty. The second suit hung like a shadow, like a ghost, like a promise that had been forgotten. Mallory did not mind, or said so in the reports. Solitude was fine. Solitude was expected. Lightkeepers were a particular kind of person. Comfortable with silence, comfortable with routine, comfortable with the long hours of nothing punctuated by the brief moments of purpose. When a ship appeared on the sensors, when the comm array crackled to life, when a voice emerged from the static, distant and small, saying, "Thank you, Beacon 17. We see your light." Those moments were enough, or should have been. Lately, Mallory had begun talking to the empty chair, just small things, observations, comments. The sort of things one might say to a companion, if a companion were there. Tea's ready. Bit cold today, don't you think? Did you hear that? In the walls? The empty chair never answered. Of course it didn't. But Mallory waited anyway, head tilted, listening, as if expecting, as if hoping. The beam swept, 14 seconds, and in the silence that followed, Mallory could almost hear it. Almost. Not words, not quite words, but something shaped like words. Something that pressed against the mind the way the beam pressed against the darkness, revealing shapes that might be there, might be shadows, might be nothing at all. The first impossible thing happened on a Tuesday, or what Mallory called Tuesday. The days had names because they needed names, because without names they would blur and blend and become indistinguishable, and that way lay madness. Tuesday, the beam swept. And in the light, just for a moment, Mallory saw something. A shape. Drifting past the observation port, the beam illuminated it, angular, dark, tumbling slowly. Debris, Mallory thought. Must be debris. Old hull plating, maybe. Fragment of a wrecked ship. Piece of a satellite, centuries old, lost and forgotten. The beam moved on. Darkness returned. 14 seconds. The beam swept again. The shape was still there, the same distance. But the shape was different. Larger or smaller, or not angular at all, but curved, organic, something that might have been. The beam moved on. Mallory stood, crossed to the port, pressed hands and face against the cold glass, breath fogging the surface. Waited. 14 seconds. The beam swept. Nothing. The shape was gone. Mallory stood there for a long time, watching the darkness, watching the place where the shape had been, or hadn't been, or had been imagined. The station groaned. The beam swept. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. That night, though night was only a word, only a decision to dim the lights and lie down and close one's eyes, that night, Mallory dreamed. In the dream, the beam was a voice, not speaking, singing. A low, resonant hum that vibrated through the hull, through the bones, through the skull, until it was impossible to tell where the sound ended and thought began. In the dream, Mallory walked through the station, and every surface was covered in writing, the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Words in a language Mallory didn't know but somehow understood, saying the same thing over and over. It sees you. It sees you. It sees you. And the beam swept, and with each sweep the words rearranged themselves, became different words, became, "Do you see it?" And Mallory woke, or thought it was waking. The observation deck was dark. 14 seconds. Everything was in order. Everything was fine. But Mallory's hands were shaking, and would not stop shaking. And tea was brewed to calm them, and the cup was held tight, so tight the knuckles whitened, and still the shaking continued. And Mallory whispered to the empty chair, "Did you see it? Did you see it?" The beam swept, and the empty chair said nothing. Of course it said nothing. But the silence felt different now, more deliberate, as if the chair were choosing not to answer, as if it had something to say, but was waiting for the right moment, waiting for Mallory to ask the right question, waiting for the beam to sweep just so, and then Then the beam swept. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. Act 2. The cracks began as small things, moments of confusion, brief lapses, standing in the galley with no memory of walking there. Finding the logbook open to a page filled with entries. Mallory didn't remember writing. Discovering the second suit moved, hanging on a different hook. Though no one else was aboard, no one else could be aboard. Small things. Easily explained. Fatigue, distraction. The mind playing tricks in the monotony of routine. The beam swept. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. The routine continued. Check the instruments. Brew the tea. Sit in the observation deck. Watch the nothing. But the nothing was changing. Or Mallory was changing. Or the beam was revealing what had always been there, hidden in the dark, waiting to be seen. The second impossible thing happened without warning. Mallory was checking the hull seals, walking the narrow corridor that circled the station's outer edge, shining a light into the access panels, looking for cracks, for stress fractures, for any sign of failure. The beam swept outside, visible through the small portholes, a rhythmic pulse of light. And in one of the portholes, for just a moment, Mallory saw a face. Not outside, reflected in the glass. But not Mallory's face, someone else's, a stranger's. Hollow-eyed and pale, mouth open as if speaking, as if screaming, but making no sound. Mallory spun. The corridor was empty. Of course it was empty. There was no one else aboard. The beam swept. Mallory turned back to the porthole. The reflection was gone. Only Mallory's own face stared back, haggard and worn, eyes too wide, skin stretched tight over the bones. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. When had that happened? When had Mallory begun to look like that? Someone who had been hollowed out and filled with something else. Something that wore Mallory's features but was not Mallory at all. The beam swept. 14 seconds. Mallory touched the glass. It was cold, so cold, as if the void beyond had seeped through. As if the nothing were reaching in. As if the station were no longer a barrier but a membrane, thin and porous, allowing things to pass both ways. The log entries began to change. At first, Mallory didn't notice. The routine was automatic. Sit at the console, open the logbook, record the day's readings, the system statuses, the beacon's function. But one evening, or what passed for evening, Mallory opened the logbook and found an entry that shouldn't exist. 14 seconds. The date was yesterday. 14 seconds. But the handwriting was different. 14 seconds. Slanted where Mallory's was straight. Pressed hard where Mallory's was light. The beam is watching me. Mallory stared at the page, turned back through the entries. No one else was here. Unless... Mallory looked at the empty chair. It sat in shadow, just beyond the reach of the console's light. The beam swept outside. For a moment, the light caught the chair, and it seemed occupied. A figure sitting there, hunched and still, watching Mallory with eyes that were dark and deep and endlessly patient. The beam moved on. The chair was empty. Of course it was empty. Mallory stood, legs unsteady, crossed to the chair, touched its back. Solid. As if someone had just risen from it. As if someone had been sitting there, waiting, and had stepped away the moment Mallory turned to look. The station groaned. The beam swept, Mallory whispered. And Mallory understood, with a certainty that had no source, no logic, no reason. The station was not empty. Had never been empty. Something else was here. Had always been here. Sleep became impossible, or rather, it became something else. Mallory would lie in the bunk, eyes closed, breathing slow, and drift. Not into sleep, into somewhere else. A place between waking and sleeping, between thought and dream, where the beam's rhythm continued. Sweep, 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 and with each sweep, memories surfaced. But not Mallory's memories, someone else's. A child running through a field, an old woman standing at a window watching rain, a man's hands, scarred and calloused, holding a rope. Whose memories? Whose life? The beam swept, and the memories continued, relentless, overlapping, blending, until Mallory couldn't tell which thoughts were original and which were imported, which feelings were genuine and which were borrowed from someone, something else. And the voice began. Not in the vents, not in the walls, in the mind itself, barely a whisper, saying, "You are not alone." Mallory tried to wake, tried to sit up, tried to open eyes that felt welded shut. The voice continued. "You have never been alone. The beam watches. The beam knows. The beam remembers everyone who came before." And Mallory saw them, all the keepers, all the ones who had manned the station before. Decades of them, centuries of them, standing in a line that stretched back into darkness, each face pale and hollow, each mouth moving soundlessly, each hand reaching forward, reaching for Mallory, reaching as if to say, "Join us, stay, the beam will keep you." Mallory woke screaming, or thought it was screaming, but no sound came out, just breath, ragged and fast. The observation deck was dark. The beam swept. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. Mallory sat up, chest heaving, hands clutching the sheets. The second bunk across the room was occupied. Someone was lying there. And in the darkness, Mallory heard breathing. Not Mallory's own, someone else's. The station groaned. The beam swept. 14 seconds. And the silence that followed was worse than any sound. The beam swept. 14 seconds. Mallory stood, chest tight, breath shallow, staring at the dark screen, willing it to stay dark, to show nothing, to be nothing. But the reflection in the black glass showed something else. Behind Mallory, the chair was empty, cracking, crumbling, falling apart in the face of something that could not be explained, could not be rationalized, could only be endured. The beam swept, and swept, and swept. And Mallory stood in the observation deck, laughing, crying, shaking, and whispered to the empty room, "I see you." And the room whispered back, "I see you." Act 3. Time became unreliable. Mallory would sit at the console, checking instruments, and blink, and hours would pass. Or minutes. Or days. The clock still turned, but its numbers felt arbitrary, felt like symbols that no longer corresponded to anything real. The beam swept. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. Or was it 15 now? Or 13? Had it always been 14? Mallory checked the logs. Every entry said the same. Rotation period, 14 seconds. But watching it now, counting silently, it felt longer. Or shorter. Or variable. Changing with each sweep. As if the beam itself were breathing, expanding and contracting. A living thing with its own rhythm, its own purpose. The station groaned, always groaning now. Not the settling of metal, not the flex of joints, but something deeper, something that sounded almost like words. Almost like a voice speaking in a language Mallory didn't know but could almost understand, saying, "Listen." Mallory listened and heard. The hum of the life support, the whisper of the air recyclers, the tick of the cooling systems, and beneath it all, woven through it all, the sound of the beam. Not a sound. More than a sound. A frequency, a vibration. Something that resonated in the bones, in the blood, in the spaces between neurons, saying without words, "I am here. I have always been here. You have always been mine." The conversations with the empty chair became constant. Mallory no longer tried to stop them. What was the point? The chair was there. The chair was empty. The chair was occupied. All three were true, depending on when you looked, depending on how the light fell, depending on whether the beam had just swept, or was about to sweep, or was sweeping now, illuminating the figure that sat there, patient and still, listening. "Do you remember?" Mallory asked, when we arrived. The chair said nothing. Or perhaps it nodded. Or perhaps Mallory nodded, and the chair reflected the motion, a mirror of gesture, a shadow of intent. "I don't remember," Mallory continued. "I should remember. It was only, how long? 16 months? 18? Less?" The beam swept. "It feels longer. It feels like I've been here forever. Like I was born here. Like there was never a life before this." The chair listened. "Do you feel that way too?" The beam swept, and in the sweep's light, just for a moment, the chair was occupied. A figure sat there, wearing Mallory's face. Wearing Mallory's clothes, but older, thinner, hollowed out, and its mouth moved, forming words that took a moment to reach Mallory's ears. "There is no before. There is only the beam. There is only the sweep." The light moved on. The chair was empty again, but the words remained, echoing in the spaces between thoughts, sinking deeper with each repetition, each sweep, each passage of light across the void. There is no before. Mallory tried to remember Earth. Tried to remember the training facility, the briefing room, the shuttle that had brought Mallory here. But the memories were thin, translucent, like images projected on smoke. Had there been a shuttle, or had Mallory always been here? The station groaned. The beam swept. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. Or was it? Mallory checked the clock. It read 3:47. Checked again. 3:47. The numbers weren't changing, or were changing too fast to see. The sound echoed in the observation deck, bounced off the walls, came back distorted, came back as someone else's laughter, came back as the sound the beam made when it swept, a low resonant hum that was almost joy, almost triumph, almost the sound of something saying, "Yes, now you understand. Now you see." The fourth impossible thing was the beam itself, and realized the beam was not pointing outward. It was pointing inward, had always been pointing inward. The lens rotated, the light emerged, and instead of piercing the void, it curved, bent back, focused on the station itself, illuminating the hull, the ports, the surfaces, and most of all, seeing through flesh and bone and thought, seeing whatever it was that made Mallory Mallory, and cataloging it, recording it, claiming it. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere the beam could not reach. Mallory collapsed on the bunk, breathing hard, eyes closed, hands pressed to face, trying to block it out, trying to... The beam swept. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. Even through closed eyelids, Mallory could see it. A pulse. 14 seconds. Sweep. And with the sweep, a voice. No, not a voice. Something deeper than voice. Something that spoke directly into thought. You cannot leave. A web. A place where light bent inward, where minds were caught, where keepers came and stayed and became part of the sweep, part of the rhythm, part of the beam itself. How many keepers had there been? How many voices now lived in the sweep? How many faces watched from the empty chair? The beam swept. And Mallory saw them all. A crowd of figures, translucent and pale, standing in the observation deck, in the galley, in the corridors, all wearing uniforms like Mallory's, all hollow-eyed and still, all watching with expressions that might have been pity, might have been welcome, might have been hunger. They opened their mouths. They spoke in unison. The beam swept, and Mallory whispered, 14 seconds. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. The log entries stopped making sense. Mallory tried to maintain them, tried to hold on to the routine, but the words kept changing. One entry read, Day unknown. The beam swept. It always sweeps. I'm swept with it. Another. I saw myself today, standing in the corridor. We looked at each other. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. The beam swept. When I looked again, I was gone. And another. There are two of us now, or three, or more. The chair is always occupied. I am always in it. I am always watching myself. The beam shows me. The beam knows. The handwriting changed from line to line. Mallory's script, then someone else's, then back again. Or were they the same? Had they always been the same? The beam swept. 14 seconds. Mallory stared at the page, at the words, and could not remember writing them. Could not remember not writing them. Could not remember a time when the page was blank. The logbook had always been full. The station had always been occupied. The beam had always swept. There was no beginning. There would be no end. Only the light. Only the sweep. Only the endless, patient watching of something vast and old, and utterly indifferent to the small, fragile minds it collected. The mirror in the sleeping quarters showed a stranger. Mallory stood before it, studying the face, the way the beam held the darkness, illuminating, revealing, claiming. And in each fragment, a face, Mallory's face, all speaking in unison. You cannot break what is already broken. You cannot escape what is already inside. The beam swept. And the voices laughed. And Mallory laughed with them, or both. The station no longer distinguished between sounds, between emotions, between one keeper and another. All were the same. All were light. All were swept. Act 4. The beam swept. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. Darkness returned like a tide crawling back over drowned sand, slow and cold, and claiming everything it touched. Mallory stood exactly where the light left him, breath thin, eyelids fluttering, mouth half open in a shape between a word and a gasp. The station hummed under him, and the hum felt too alive, too intent, too much like listening. He blinked, and the first memory dissolved, not drifted, not faded, small, brown, the smell of its ears after rain. He reached for it instinctively, like grabbing at a falling glass, but it was already spreading thin, thinning to mist, mist to nothing. He exhaled sharply, the kind of exhale someone makes when the world changes 1 inch to the left without warning. The beam swept. 14 seconds. His childhood hallway blurred next. Doorframe. Wallpaper. The corner where he once hid to scare his sister. All thinning, dimming, falling away like old paint flaking from a shutter. He whispered, "No, no, no." 14 seconds. His whisper came back to him, slightly delayed, slightly wrong, as if replayed by someone practicing his voice. He staggered back from the porthole. The corridor's length distorted. The bulkheads bowed inward, then outward, breathing in slow, obscene imitation of lungs. Mallory pressed both palms flat against the wall. The metal felt warm, almost feverish. He drew a breath. The beam swept. 14 seconds. Something slipped in his mind again. Not a memory this time, but a feeling, a familiar emotional thread connecting him to a place that might once have been home. Gone. Snapped. As if some careful hand under the floorboards was snipping wires inside him one by one. He barked a laugh. A cracked, hollow, high laugh that didn't match the shape of his face. He hit the wall. A dull, fleshy thud. A smear of red. He pressed his forehead into the metal and whispered, "Stop, stop, stop, stay together." The station answered by groaning softly, an old iron groan, loaded with patience, as if humored by his plea. The beam swept. 14 seconds. Mallory lurched down the corridor, shoulder hitting the bulkhead, boots scraping. His balance had left. His center of gravity wandered like a drunk thought. He reached the galley table and caught the edge, breath heaving. The logbook lay open. He didn't remember opening it. Pen waiting, pages yearning. His hand shook violently as he lowered the nib. I'm thinning. Another sweep. 14 seconds. He wrote again, the letters jagged. There was a dog once, I think. The name, The pen dragged sideways, tore the page. Why can't I remember the name? The room tilted around him. The beam swept. The light passed over the empty chair on the other side of the table. It breathed. Subtle. The darkness returned. The chair was still. He waited. 14 seconds. The beam swept. The chair breathed again, the back flexing in a slow, abhorrent imitation of ribs. Mallory stumbled away, overturning a mug, porcelain shattering across the floor like ice. No, no, no. He moved fast enough to lose track of his own limbs. His shadow lagged behind by a beat before catching him. His reflection in the porthole took longer, a faint silhouette that blinked late, mouth opening on a delay. 14 seconds. The beam swept. Another memory went, this one larger. A building, tall, pale. Something important had happened there, something formative. Now it was nothing but fog. He tried to recall its name, its address, the color of the stone. Nothing, a place in his mind where a building should have stood, now leveled. The panic rose in him like a tide. He tried to ground himself, breath in, breath out, but breathing felt foreign, like an art he'd learned long ago and forgotten. 14 seconds. He laughed again, a wild, strangled sound that bordered on a scream. He crawled toward the sleeping berth. Not walked, crawled, palms dragging over the deck, nails scraping, knees thudding. He wanted to lie down, wanted to shut his eyes, wanted to hide his brain behind something solid. He reached the berth and collapsed into it, curling tightly, shivering though the temperature was stable. The beam swept. Behind his eyelids, the light found him anyway, bright and red and unbearable. 14 seconds. He whispered the numbers like a prayer. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. Each repetition steadied him less. Each repetition erased him more. The next thing to go was his mother's voice. Not the memory, the sound. He tried to recall it, tried to reconstruct the timbre, the softness, the warning tone she used when he had wandered too close to the road. But the sound was gone. The shape of her mouth remained, detached, floating. No voice. He whimpered. A grown adult man, curled like a terrified dog, whimpering into the pillow. 14 seconds. The beam swept. Not in the room. Inside him. A clean break, the mind stumbling over itself. The world began to double. Then treble. Then drop frames like a failing vid feed. Voices in the vents rippled like underwater speech. The metal beneath him hummed in a pitch that matched his heartbeat. His heartbeat matched the lens rotation. The lens rotation matched the station's slow iron breathing. Everything synchronized. Everything merged. 14 seconds. 14 seconds. He pressed his hands to his face and sobbed. Real sobbing. The kind that shrinks the chest and leaves the throat raw. He tried to speak. Couldn't. He tried to scream. Couldn't. He tried to remember his own name. Couldn't. The beam swept. Mallory's muscles went slack. His eyes rolled. His body fell still, utterly still, as if someone had unplugged him. No twitch, no breath, no thought. Darkness swallowed everything. Then nothing. A long, deep, absolute nothing. The reset. Light entered softly, not the harsh light of interrogation, not the monstrous sweep of a devouring lens, a gentle dawn-like glow. Mallory sat upright at the console, clear-eyed, fully himself. He lifted a cup of tea, fresh, warm, and took a slow sip. Steam rose. He exhaled contentedly. The station hummed around him, a peaceful old engine tending its routines. The logs displayed green checks across every system. He looked out the porthole toward the stars. Probably a trick of distance. He sipped again. Outside, unshaped, the lighthouse hung alone in the dark. Its great lens cutting a blade of light across endless black. In that blade drifted a figure, a suit, frosted, turning slowly end over end. The visor was opaque with ice, but behind it sat a face contorted by vacuum. Bulging eyes, lips torn back, skin split at the corners. The hands were curled like claws, the limbs frozen mid-tension. Across the chest plate, iced over but legible, Mallory, 10,097. The beam swept over him. 14 seconds. His body rotated gently, weightless, unbothered, drifting forever in the quiet wake of the light. Darkness reclaimed him. Back inside, Mallory 10,098 finished his tea, set the empty cup down with a soft clink. He looked out again, thoughtful. He blinked, smiled faintly. "Thought I saw something," he murmured, amused at himself. But the void was empty, perfectly empty. He stretched his shoulders, straightened his uniform, and settled in for another quiet shift. The beam swept. 14 seconds. 14 seconds.